C.S. Lewis described faith this way. I love this quote. It says, "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I can see everything else." And that's what faith does. We not only see faith and the object of our faith, but it makes everything else more clear in our lives. Faith is seeing everything through a new set of eyes, both the seen and the unseen. And while many things still remain a mystery, faith allows us to be able to see beyond the unseeable. As Hebrews 11:1 says, that faith is the conviction of things unseen. We can't see everything going on, but we have a conviction that we can stand on, that the unseen for us is seen by God, and we can trust him even if we can't see what's going on. Because we see with eyes of faith, and when we have the eyes of faith, we can then take footsteps. I mean, it's hard to walk in the dark when you can't see, right? But as the light of faith comes before us, we can take those steps in the darkness and keep moving forward because we have an assurance of things that we hope for, as the rest of Hebrews 11:1 tells us. When we looked at chapter 2 of Romans a couple weeks ago, the concept of a righteousness that's not based on the law, but a righteousness that comes from faith is introduced. Because you see, we all break God's laws. Laws that were not set up to take away our fun or to make us miserable, but laws that teach us how to love. Laws that teach us how to love God and love other people. And that's what God's laws are all about. We're people made in God's image. We're made for his glory and for his worship and to give him thanks in all things, but we violated them. And that puts us in a category of being sinners upon whom the wrath of God is found. But, there's a big but God's loving kindness comes to us. And he's made a way for that wrath to be wiped away. And that's by the sacrifice that Jesus made. Because keeping the law of God for us humans, it's impossible. So Jesus came along and he said, "I will keep the laws for you. So you don't have to." And we can't anyway, right? Okay, that doesn't mean they're obsolete, okay? But God set up a new standard for us. He says, if you live by a righteousness that comes through faith, then you're free from that burden of trying to keep God's laws perfectly. How we beat ourselves up sometimes because we just keep doing the wrong things over and over again and we don't do the right things we're supposed to do. And while that still stands, God's law still stands, that's not what we're judged by anymore. We're judged by our faith. Jesus says, I want you to have a new way. Look at me. I kept the law for you. And I want you to walk and keep your eyes on me as you maneuver this world. And so, Jesus kept the law, but we're told, keep the faith. And that's what we're doing today. In chapters 4 and 5, Paul is going to keep explaining what this saving faith looks like. So we'll look at 4 this week and actually the first half of chapter 5 next Sunday before we get into some Easter things here. But you'll see this leads us right up to Easter in a very perfect way. And so Paul's writing this and he says, I'm going to give you an example of faith. And I'm going to give you the example of a person that lived, a person that they were all very familiar with. And that was their patriarch, the father of their nation, Abraham, who lived several thousand years before this. He was not a perfect man, but he was made righteous before God because of his faith. The same process that happens today. We are made righteous through faith as well. So Abraham is a great example to us about how to be able to live by the law of faith. One of the problems with the idea of salvation is that we tend to think that it's some sort of reward. If I'm good enough, I deserve it, or I'll get it on my own. But salvation comes by faith in response to an offer that God gives, just like it did for Abraham. And in the book of Genesis, when we meet Abraham for the first time, he's 75 years old. He's living in a nomadic area of Mesopotamia. And as far as what we know, he was a pagan. He wasn't looking to God. He didn't know who God was. He was worshiping false gods, as his people were. But God chose to reveal himself to Abraham. It wasn't based on anything about Abraham. Just God appeared to him and chose him as a voice coming out of the sky one night. And not only did God speak to Abraham, but God gave him a really big offer. God told Abraham, said, Abraham, you're going to be the father of a great nation. And then later he told him, you're going to be the father of many nations. So that means there's only one thing that's needed of Abraham, right? He has to be a dad. Although there was a problem, because at the age of 75, and with a wife who was 10 years younger than he was, they had not been able to make this happen during all their years of being together. I'm sure Abraham went home and he told Sarah what he heard. And of course, as the record tells us, what'd she do? She laughed. Like, really? This is impossible. Not only was Sarah past her childbearing years, but her womb had been barren all along. So really, there's nothing Abraham can do about this. God says, you're going to be a father. You're going to have nations that are going to come off of you. The offspring is going to look like the number of the stars in the sky. And he's looking at it going, no, I don't think so, God. This is impossible. Talk about a mountain that needed to be moved in front of him. This was one of those. He didn't even know God. He didn't have any promises of God. He didn't know that, I heard this voice that said, this is the God of everything. And this God told me that something impossible was going to happen. He couldn't look back at other promises that God had fulfilled and go, okay, well, God did it in the past. He can do it again. We have that advantage, but he did not have that. So really, there's nothing that Abraham could do except for one thing, and that was to believe that what God had told him was true. Abraham believed that the promise would somehow come to pass. He had faith in the words of God. He had faith in God himself. And even though Abraham had no previous idea who this God was, he had never seen what he'd done before, he had the faith to do what? To believe. That was the first step, was to believe. Abraham's starting from scratch here. He's a blank slate. He has nothing to go by except that he's sure that he heard God's voice come out to him and speak to him in the middle of the night. Nobody else heard it. He couldn't go back to somebody and say, did I really hear that right? Is that what it really said? Was it some sort of hallucination? Was it some sort of dream I had? I mean, I'm sure at times he kind of wondered if it was all okay upstairs. But Abraham, even though this seemed crazy and that these words were against all odds, he still believed. And it says that Abraham was counted righteous because he had faith, because he believed. And that's what his righteousness came from. Later on, God told Abraham some other crazy things as well. And Abraham took God at his word. One of those things was, leave your family and your land, and I'm going to lead you to a new land. So here he's got to pack up everything he has without even knowing where he's going, just following God one step at a time, and God leads him to what was known as the land of Canaan, a land that God said, these are the boundaries. Get up on the mountain. As far as you can see, this land belongs to you and to your descendants, which he didn't have yet. The years went by, and there was no offspring to speak of. And a paternal heart and a maternal heart was aching to know, okay, now we have this new hope that's been revived. Okay, where is it? How is it coming? Is God not living up to his word? How many nights did Abraham look up at those stars and say, okay, God, is it time yet? When's this going to happen? Did he wrestle with his doubts? So about 15 years into this whole thing, okay, 15 years, okay, we're talking about years here, Abraham decides that, well, God said I'd have a child, and obviously nothing's happening with my wife Sarah, so I'm just going to take matters into my own hands, and I'm going to sleep with Sarah's young servant and produce a child through her. That was something the pagans did at that time. You could produce children through the slaves or the servants that were in your possession there. And even though it wasn't a moral answer to the question, Abraham's like, okay, well, nothing's happened yet, so I guess this is a plan that could work. Well, and Sarah's servant Hagar did bring forth a son. They named him Ishmael. And although he was loved, he was not the son, the promised son that God had said. Abraham jumped the gun, and he didn't wait on the Lord. Although 15 years seems like long enough to say, okay, God, are you going to do your thing yet? And he had already waited a long time, and it almost feels kind of like a cruel joke, doesn't it? Like, God, is he just teasing him? Is there something going on? But God going silent, leaving them to miserably wait and try to figure it out, this wasn't teasing, but it was a testing. It was a testing of faith. It wasn't God being mean, but testing in a way that faith could be revealed. If God gave us everything immediately on a silver platter whenever we rang the bell, would there be any need for faith? No, that would just be God spoiling us, being at our beck and call, and we'd get pretty lazy about it. But the only way we know that faith exists is when it's tested. That's the nature of faith. When it's tested, then it teaches us what faith is, because we have to live by that faith in hope for the results at the end. Faith has to be pushed to the limit in order for it to become stronger and deeper and to actually be what we call faith. Because if you can see it with your eyes, if you can touch it with your hands, and if it's just there anytime you want it, it's not faith, is it? The law of faith says that it's something we have to wait for. It's something that goes through testing, and then it comes out and is revealed in our lives. If you were standing on a cliff and there was a rope bridge to go across, I admit I would be very scared to do it. But if I needed to get across there, I would have to have faith that that rope bridge is going to get me across, right? Now that would be a test, because my courage would be tested, and the endurance of being able to walk across there and get to the other side and keep my eyes on the other side and not look down, that would be a test. And that's what faith does. It's a test. And Abraham is being tested when he's being told, pack up, go settle a new land. And Abraham is being tested because he ended up having to wait 25 years for this son to be born from the womb of his wife, Sarah. Here he is, he's a 100-year-old man, and his wife is 90 years old. And she becomes pregnant. And they become parents of the promised son, whom they name Isaac, whose name means laughter, because they laughed at the idea in the first place, but then they laughed for joy when that child came 25 years later. Abraham had a couple more tests of faith that God put before him. When God told him he would become the father of a new nation, he was an old man then, but that was when God said, I want you to put a mark on your body that says you belong to me, and I want all of your sons to have a mark on their body. And that's when God instituted the ritual of circumcision. We talked about that a couple weeks ago, that it's not really about the mark on the body, it's about a mark on a heart. God says, yeah, the mark on the body was there for his people to be able to know who they belonged to, and that even the most intimate part of their body belonged to God. And today, God says, I want that circumcision of your heart. I want your heart to belong to me, that scar is there because you're broken, and the sin has been removed, and now you have my presence there. And so Paul had to, in chapter 2, explain to these Jewish people, it's not about the mark on your body anymore that was even given to Abraham, but it's about the mark on your heart. Let God mark our hearts. And so that was a matter of faith as well. Because the heart, you can't see the mark. How do we know if that mark is there? How do we know if God has circumcised our heart and taken off the bad and put in the good? That takes faith as well. And I can't see your hearts. You can't see mine. But by faith, we are able to accept that God has done something in our heart and taken it and made it from being a heart of stone into a heart of flesh that can beat for him. And that he can come and live within that heart, and his spirit is there. And that's faith as well. And that spirit comes in, and the spirit starts to rearrange the way we make decisions and the way our attitudes are and the way we can reach out and love people that might be unlovable on our own. It changes our character, our actions. We start doing things we never did before, or we start not doing things we used to do because the Spirit of God has come into that heart. And that's faith. We can see the footsteps or the fruit of the faith, but we can't actually see it. We can't see what God's done in our heart. And so these tests that were given to Abraham, having to move, having to wait 25 years for this promised child, having a scar on his most private part of his body, if those weren't tests enough, God gave him one ultimate test, one that was harder than all of these combined. When that promised child Isaac was still a boy, God told Abraham, I want you to take your son Isaac. I want you to put him on the altar and sacrifice him for forgiveness of sins. Take your son and do that. And of course, Abraham's thinking, but this is the son I waited for 25 years. I love this boy. I mean, we all love our kids. You can't imagine ever having to take God's words to murder your own child. And that sounds very cruel. It's like, what kind of God would ask for that? Although when you think about it, God let his own son be murdered as well. So God didn't ask a person to do anything that he wasn't willing to do himself. It seems like a cruel trick to play, but Abraham took God at his word, and he raised that sword, that knife, to be able to slice the throat of his son laying there on that altar, ready to give him back to the Lord. But God intervened right at the last minute and said, Abraham, no, don't do this. I know that you trust me. I know you can take me at my word. I know that anything I tell you, the promises I give to you, are going to be hidden in your heart because you're going to trust me. And so God stepped in and said, this man, Abraham, he's an example of faith, a person who believed God's words and lived by them, even though they were very difficult. These 4 tests of faith give us this example, this illustration. And Paul is going to take Romans chapter 4 to say, just look at Abraham as an example of what faith is. And so we're going to read through chapter 4, read a couple verses at a time, make a little commentary on it, and just learn a little bit about this faith of Abraham and how we can follow in Abraham's footsteps of faith as well. I don't think any of the things that God promised Abraham he's going to give to us to do. He gives us other things to do. I think we can handle them with that kind of faith. So it starts out, it says, what then shall we say was gained by Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, then he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Okay, was Abraham declared righteous by what he did? No, he was declared righteous even before he did them, because he believed in his heart. That was the basis of his righteousness. Yes, what he believed in his heart led him to action, and that's the way it should be. We can believe stuff in our heart, but if we don't end up having it change us, then it's not really faith, is it? But faith is going to lead to obedience and actions. But it wasn't the actions that actually justified Abraham, but by believing God's words. Faith in God is boasting in what God has done, not in what we have done. We can't just say, oh, I have this awesome faith. I've been able to follow through and do all the things God wanted me to. That's not a kind of faith that rests in God, but it rests in ourselves. We don't want that. We want to be able to not boast about ourselves, but to be able to boast in the God who leads us, the object of our faith. It's not about us and what we have done, but it's about what Jesus has done. He kept the law. He kept the faith, and he asks us to live by faith as well. Going on in verse 4 and 5, now to the one who works, his wages are not counted as a gift, but as his due. And to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted as righteousness. So he compares here. What's the difference between wages and a gift? Okay, our bosses give us wages, right? Not because they love us, although they might have a good relationship, but they love us, but they give us the wages because we earned it. We showed up at work. We did what we're supposed to do, right? And so the agreement is, I do this for you, and the boss gives us the money, and that's wages. But God doesn't want to give us wages. That's not the kind of God he is. He doesn't want us to work for something, to earn it. He wants us to just accept a gift. We love getting gifts from our loved ones, right? Because they love us. And they give us gifts that show, that communicate the love that they have towards us. And God said, I want to give you a gift. I don't want to give you wages. I didn't want to give Abraham wages. I just want to give him a gift. I chose him, and I gave him a son and a new name, and I gave him a future and a promise. That's what God wanted to give to Abraham, and he wants to give us his promises as well, as a gift, because those are two totally different things. Even David, King David, 1,000 years after Abraham, He wrote about being forgiven as a blessing, as it's a gift. In verses 6 and 7, just as David also speaks of the blessing of the one to whom God counts righteousness apart from works, that blessed, this is from Psalm 32, blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord will not count his sin. Paul's reminding that even David, he knew that this gift of righteousness, this forgiveness, this salvation from the Lord was a gift that was given to him, and how blessed we are. Getting your wages isn't a blessing because you worked for it, right? But getting a gift is a blessing. It's something that blesses us. And that's what Paul reminds us here. And he goes on, he starts talking about the circumcision thing again, because the Jewish people he's writing to, they thought, hey, it's all about what's on the outside. It's about belonging to this nation, okay, belonging to this people group and having the mark. And that was their pride. So he goes on and he says, is this blessing then only for the circumcised or also for the uncircumcised? For we say that faith was counted to Abraham as righteousness. So how was it counted to him? Was it before or after he had been circumcised? It was not after, but before he was circumcised. In other words, he's saying the mark on the outside is not the faith. It was what was on the inside that counts. He received the sign of circumcision as the seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. The purpose was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised, so that the righteousness could be counted to them as well, and to make him the father of the circumcised, who are not merely circumcised, but who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. And that's a long sentence there that just goes around and round, but he's basically saying this radical idea that Abraham became father of a nation not based on genealogy, but based on faith. It wasn't about the marks. The marks were an action as a result of faith. And we, whether we belong to the Jewish nation or not, we can all have the same faith in our hearts, and that Abraham can be the father of all of us, and we can walk in his footsteps and live by faith, the same faith in Jesus. We can call Abraham our father because both Abraham was justified by faith and we are justified by faith as well. And if God made Abraham righteous through faith, what makes us any different? Our faith makes us righteous as well in God's eyes. When I was in my 20s and really growing as a Christian, I did a Bible study about the life of Abraham. And ever since then, I've really loved Abraham. And I can't wait to sit down with him in heaven someday and be able to know more of his story, if that's something we get to do up there. But I love the fact that he was a man that lived by faith. He lived by promises that he didn't even get to see for a long time. And all of us could do that just as well. We're no less off than Abraham. Now, covenants and promises of God are more important than the law. The law still exists. We still need to live by the law, but the law is not what justifies us. What we do and don't do is not what makes us right in God's eyes. It's living by faith. And if we live by faith, then it helps us to be able to follow God's laws. So we got to get the horse before the cart here, and it's about faith, not about keeping the law when it all comes down to it. So going on, it says, for the promise to Abraham and his offspring would be that he would be heir of the world did not come through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For it is the adherents of the law who are to be the heirs. Faith is null and the promise is void. For the law brings wrath, but where there is no law, there is no transgression. And the Jews held very tightly to the laws that Moses gave. Those were from God, and yes, they were vitally important because the law teaches us how to love. But faith is based on the promises of God, and the promises given to Abraham and to us as well. And so we learn to live not based on a righteousness from the law, but a righteousness by faith. Verse 16, that is why it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his offspring, not only to the adherent of the law, but also to the one who shares the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. You know, God gave Abraham that promise, not just to be the father of a nation, but many nations. And most of us in this room do not have Jewish genealogy, okay? But whether we have the genealogy of Abraham through our blood or not, we are all part of the nations that come together to be able to be part of that nation that God was creating back then. Started with one and kept adding and spreading it out to everybody. And so all who believe in Jesus live by faith, who follow in the footsteps of Abraham from any nation on the earth. We are brought into that family of God by faith. And Abraham had no idea then what God was going to do. How's this going to be possible at all, that there would be nations and nations of people that would be his offspring? But that is who we are if we are righteous by faith. As it is written, I have made you the father of many nations. In the presence of the God in whom he believed, he gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. In hope, he believed against hope, that he should become the father of many nations, as he had been told. So shall your offspring be. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was as good as dead since he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. No unbelief made him waver concerning the promises of God, but he grew strong in the faith as he gave glory to God, fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. And that is why his faith was counted to him as righteousness. Abraham believed God could give life to a barren womb and give life again to his sacrificed son. Faith that leads from death to life, that's extreme faith. I mean, death is so final. Death is so final. But to be able to believe that God holds life and death in his hands, he's the giver and the author of life, but he can also create resurrection as well. To be able to believe in a God that's that strong and powerful is the type of faith that saves us. We don't need a faith that just says that God's going to fulfill his promises, but a God that can turn death into life again. And as we move into Easter time, that's what it's all about. But as the words, next verses here, it was counted to him, were not written for his sake alone, but for ours also. It'll be counted to us who believe in him who raised from the dead Jesus our Lord. There, we're moving into Easter, aren't we? By believing in the resurrection of the God who came, took on the human body, and died, having kept the law, but took our death upon himself as a sacrifice. And so he could rise again so that he could give us his life. That's the faith that Abraham knew about and could only see it in the future, but we look back and we can experience it in the here and now. He was delivered up for our trespasses, and he was raised for our justification. Now, next week, we'll continue in chapter 5 and see how this happens, why the death and resurrection of Jesus is so vital for our faith. We assume that. That's why you're here today, and that's why you're watching online. But to be able to see how it all fits together will be a good stopping place in Romans. We'll pick up Romans after Easter again, but this is the type of footsteps of faith that God has for us today.